when we look across the developed countries, I'd emphasize just taking a step away from the U.S. I think there's a lot of interesting dynamics going on when we go back over the if we go back 12 or 18 months ago, there was a lot of commonality amongst the developed world economies. Like basically central banks were too easy, inflation pressures were emerging, central banks had to catch up. That wasn't really priced into markets. That led to a rise in the short rate and long rate relative to what was priced in. And that was basically a universal truth. But today, things are starting to meaningfully diverge, interestingly, at a time when the expected changes in monetary policy between these economies is actually convergent. So divergent outcomes, convergent monetary policy expectations. That's a very important and interesting point that's going on. So let's just run through that. We look at the US, has some of the strongest growth and inflation that is still a bit above, still continues to be above what the target is for the Fed. And what would that point to? That would point to tighter monetary policy, or certainly not a quick shift to easing. You look at the UK, you see moderate growth or weak growth, but inflation, core CPI, remains around 6%, kind of stuck at the 6% level, which is vastly too high relative to the mandate of the BOE. And then you see Europe, which is even different from those, where you have weak growth and inflation, particularly core inflation, which is moderated considerably over the course of the last 6 months or so. And that's what you see on the lower right-hand chart, is you see core inflation month over month, seasonally adjusted, and it matters. You got to do that carefully in the European context. And what we basically see is the last 6 months, it's been running at about 0.2%. Now, is that a little higher than the ECB would like? Sure, but we're certainly in the ballpark when it comes to thinking about the ECB meeting its mandate. And in an environment, I'd emphasize, where their target interest rates have risen considerably relative to what's going on with inflation, right? And so but when you scan across these markets and you look at what's priced into 2024, what do you see? You see the same expected change in monetary policy pretty much everywhere. And so that's what the chart on the left-hand side shows. Basically, what it's showing is the expected change in monetary policy, the curve for each one of these major developed economies. And what you see is the UK, the US, and Europe are all expected to cut in the neighborhood of 75 to 100 basis points in 2024. Well, that certainly is a pretty interesting point when you think about just how divergent the macroeconomic conditions are today across those different jurisdictions. I mean, just think about the UK versus the US. Like, while the US economy is strong, inflation has moderated considerably, right? Relative to the Fed's target. There's still more work to be done, but it has moderated. Let's compare that to the UK, where sure, growth has been a little weaker, but core inflation remains sticky at 6% and wage growth is at 8%. Like, what are the odds that the UK is going to deliver the same monetary policy change as the US over the course of the next year, given the relative macroeconomic conditions? And probably the even bigger divergence is between the UK and Europe, right? Which helps deal with those two jurisdictions, of course, help neutralize the geographic circumstances holding both in Europe. What do you see there? You see Europe and the UK are expected to ease in the same magnitude over the course of the next year. Think about that. Interest rates, real rates on the short end, which is shown on the right-hand side in Europe, currently are positive 2%, and currently in the UK are almost negative 2%. That is a radically different policy environment for those two jurisdictions. And what you see is the same expected change in the future coming from both. That's totally inconsistent with the macroeconomic realities. And so I think what's happening here is that the market participants are kind of applying an equal lens, an equal shift across the developed economies, when the reality is that the inflation and growth circumstances, in particular the inflation circumstances, are quite different between those different economies.